So just to tell you a little bit about what we do, what's consumer focus, we're the statutory consumer champion, and we used to work across the whole of the economy, but now we work exclusively on complex markets subject to regulation, particularly energy and post. You might have heard that we were being shut down, which is kind of true, but actually we're being metamorphosed into a slightly different organisation. So we're going to become Consumer Futures in May, but a lot of the work that we do on energy will still be happening, but we won't be at all consumer-facing, which we used to be to a certain extent. So just to tell you a little bit about our work to date on demand-side management, because it's a very important area for consumers, and actually sometimes the consumer element can get forgotten, although I do think that Ofgem's work, particularly with DORA on Workstream 6, is helping to redress that, which is great. So we launched a detailed position paper on smart grids and demand-side response in March 2013. I was the main author on that. And we previously had a research report on consumer engagement with current time of use tariffs, as in Economy 7 and Economy 10 mostly, published in October. We engaged quite a lot at EU level on smart grids related work, including through the EU Smart Grids Task Force, and we did some work on the Energy Efficiency Directive. We're currently engaging on the Demand Connection Code, which is a code which will govern the working of a lot of the transmission networks throughout Europe, and obviously the national grid will sign up to that. In the UK, we are members of quite a lot of groups working on smart grids, including the Ofgem and DEC Smart Grid Forum, which has just been asked to join. The Sustainability First Smart Demand Forum, so that's run by Judith, who is going to speak today, and some steering groups for some of the Low Carbon Network Fund projects as well. Oh, sorry, just gone the wrong direction. Oh, hang on. Okay. So, just thinking about what kind of impact demand-side management could have on consumers. Well, it could be extremely positive, but not necessarily. So on the positive side, it could bring considerable reductions in future electricity bills for consumers, which is obviously very positive. And also it could aid a transition to a low-carbon electricity system, which we see as a consumer issue, although not everyone necessarily would see it that way. But these benefits won't happen to consumers without their doing anything. It will require possibly quite considerable behaviour change on the part of consumers. And it could lead to some quite confusing electricity tariffs, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but it's something that we mustn't forget. And also there is a problem that some consumers who can't necessarily engage very well in the electricity market, and many of them are around today as well, won't be able to engage in demand-side management, and they might be left behind and not be able to reap some of the benefits that other consumers could reap. So we need to think about how we can deal with that. So firstly, just to talk about the benefits, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the major benefits of demand-side response or demand-side management, but you know, it can reduce future network costs, which is a benefit for consumers potentially, and it can also reduce the future costs of going onto a low-carbon generation system. We discussed, I think, earlier today about how wind is intermittent, and so the more wind penetration we have, the more useful demand-side management is to ensure that we can use more electricity when it is windy and less when it isn't. And the benefits of these things are that we could reduce electricity bills for consumers. But let's think about actually what those benefits could mean. Big issue as we talk about reducing electricity bills for consumers, which is very important because we know that actually these bills will only go up and up, so any reductions can only be relative. We have to think about how big these savings can be, and at the moment there really isn't very much consensus over how much demand-side management could reduce consumers' bills. A recent report from Department of Energy Climate Change suggested that per consumer participating in demand-side response, we could have something below £100 potentially coming back to them. But then some work by Imperial College suggests that consumers who engage in demand-side response could have 2/3 of a reduction in their bills. So that's quite a big difference in what we think the size of those savings will be, and that's something that we really think needs to be looked at more carefully. Another big question is how these benefits could come back to consumers. So would they come back in reduced unit prices, or would some of those benefits also come back to consumers just in terms of reduced network costs, network charges, which of course are added to the bill? And these are important because thinking about how those benefits come back to consumers relates to who is actually providing that demand-side response, who is providing the demand-side management, and should all consumers benefit from the value that that demand-side management produces, or should some consumers who don't engage not receive that benefit? And it's quite a big issue, because on the one hand you could have some consumers benefiting from other people's behaviour change, and is that fair? But on the other hand, there's the question of, well, some consumers may not be capable of moving their demand around, and is it fair that they're not able to benefit? So yeah, that's one of the issues that we are trying to think very hard about at the moment. And as I'm sure you know I'm about to say, there are some quite serious challenges to getting consumers to engage in demand-side management, and also thereby getting consumers to get some of those benefits. A big issue, which actually Judith talks about a lot in the paper that was sort of being presented to you earlier, discusses that there isn't necessarily such a great match-up between demand which is movable and demand which produces peak. And obviously, as we know, in demand-side management, what we really want to be doing is reducing peaks. And a lot of peak load when people get home from work is things like cooking, which people may have trouble moving, heating, which unless they've got excellent storage, they may also have trouble moving, things like watching TV. And there has been some research done on how willing consumers are to shift those loads. And it's not clear at the moment that they are willing to shift them as much as perhaps we might need them to do. So that's quite a serious issue. Another one related to that is about whether the incentives to get consumers to shift their load will be great enough to get them to change their behaviour. If it is the case, as Imperial suggests, that people could reduce their bills by 2/3 by shifting their demand, then yes, perhaps maybe those incentives will be great enough. But if there's not quite so much value available, and if you cook now, or if you cook in 2 hours' time, you'll save 20p. If you wait with cooking, it's not clear people will shift their demand. So that's quite a serious issue. Perhaps one of the most effective ways, as we've also heard earlier today, to shift demand, to manage demand, is to use automation. But at the moment, we don't know how consumers will react to automation in their homes. Maybe some people won't care too much how their heating systems are controlled as long as their houses are warm, but other people might really have an issue with somebody controlling when their car is charged or when their washing machine is on. And we also need to be very careful about media scare stories about Big Brother, about the spy in the home, and about the government controlling your washing machine. People might have seen a Daily Mail article on Sunday about the National Grid controlling a washing machine. I'm not going to comment on that because it's probably not wise. But you know, that's only the beginning of the kinds of misinformation that may. Some of it will be misinformation, not all of it necessarily will be, but the kinds of issues that the PR around this kind of thing will need to encounter and deal with. So as well as thinking about whether people can shift their demand, there's also the question of whether they'll understand the tariffs, the energy deals that they could get onto, which should be encouraging them to shift their demand. So people may be aware that Ofgem has recently conducted a retail market review of the domestic market, which is aimed at simplifying the way in which energy companies can offer deals. And it's unclear to us how tariffs which encourage demand-side response fit with that, because obviously they will make the demand-side response, or trying to get consumers to engage in demand-side response, will make tariffs more complex, but by their nature. It's not to say that's necessarily a bad thing, but we do have to think about how accessible these things will be to consumers, because if they're not, we won't get the response we want out of them, and then we won't get the benefits. And just to put that in context, the work we did on current demand-side response tariffs, or the only one that really is around now, which is Economy 7, we found that actually some consumers are really quite confused about it, even though it's very simple. 30% of consumers that we talked to who are on Economy 7 might not get any benefit from it because of the kinds of heating systems they're on. They might not have electric heating, or they might not be able to store their heating. So how do they get that benefit? Why are they on this tariff? And related to that, we also wanted to put a nice, easily readable chart up for consumers telling them how all the different Economy 7 tariffs in different regions of the UK worked and when the off-peak hours were, and we actually couldn't get that information for suppliers because it's so varied. And if we have that problem now with Economy 7, which is very simple, it's unclear to us at the moment whether the market really can take much more complex demand-side response tariffs. Another big issue related to that is it's unclear to us at the moment how consumers would be able to compare certain kinds of demand-side response tariffs, particularly dynamic ones. So with a dynamic tariff, time at which off-peak happens could change day to day depending on real-time events like the wind. If a consumer is trying to decide whether they should go onto a dynamic tariff, we can't see how a switching site or a well-meaning neighbour who gets on the internet for them or themselves could tell whether that's a good idea for them, given their usage, given their budget. And that's quite a serious issue for people who are trying to budget very carefully their energy use. And that leads me on to how do we ensure that vulnerable consumers, so consumers who have trouble engaging in markets and have trouble getting the best things that they could out of various markets, how to ensure that they can benefit from demand-side response and engage in demand-side management. So it may be the case that many vulnerable and low-income consumers could do very well on certain kinds of demand-side response tariffs, particularly those which are encouraging peak shifting, because people who are at home all day don't necessarily need to turn on their washing machine, have a shower, cook at 5 p.m. when everyone gets home from work. They could shift some of their usage to a different time of day. But it's not clear yet, really, whether they'll have the capacity to be able to change their usage effectively to do that. Many low-income consumers are less well educated, may have problems with literacy, may have problems understanding how to shift their demand. So we need to think about that very carefully. But also, vulnerable consumers, lots of studies suggest, and Ofgem also has information on this, vulnerable consumers are less likely to change electricity deals, are less likely to change suppliers, and will be less good at getting onto the deals which are best for them. And that means that those kinds of consumers may be left on the kinds of deals which are least competitive, particularly if they don't want to engage in demand-side response. And that's not necessarily something that we would wish to have come about. I mean, it's already the case now that sticky consumers, as in consumers who don't switch very often, are on the least competitive deals, but that may become a much bigger problem once we start getting demand-side response tariffs. We've also discussed automation, and that's a way in which potentially low-income and vulnerable consumers could engage in demand-side management without really having to do anything. But then again, there is this question of, well, how much does an automated device cost? Will low-income consumers be able to afford those devices? And what can we do about that? How can we make those kinds of things accessible to people so they're not priced out of the market? So, yeah, I mean, that's a very quick rattle through the work that we've been doing, or the thinking that we've been doing on demand-side response and management around domestic consumers. And we have some key asks coming out of that. The really most important one is that we really have to take seriously the challenge of engaging consumers in demand-side management. I think there has sometimes been an assumption in industry that if we set the tariffs right, consumers will just do what we need them to do, and that really isn't the case. We really have to do a lot of work on trying to get consumers to turn into prosumers, into people who understand their energy use and are active in managing it. Another big issue is that we need to investigate more closely the impact of demand-side management tariffs on low-income and vulnerable consumers. There hasn't been a lot of work around this in the UK. There was a very interesting study in Ireland which did some work around the reactions of different kinds of consumers to demand-side response tariffs, and they found that broadly people on low incomes did quite well, but the authors admit that the sample was small enough that it wasn't necessarily a robust result. So we really need more work on this. Automation could be a very important tool to get a lot of these things to happen, but it's very important that consumers have choice around whether their devices are automated, partly just in terms of their own control, but also so that we can reduce the chance that we'll get more scare stories about the government controlling a washing machine. A big issue that I haven't really touched on because it's quite complex is about how consumers are compensated for the demand-side response that they provide. And that's compensation in terms of payment, not in terms of, not in terms of getting something back because something went wrong. And how does that money filter through to consumers? Does it come through network charges, as I said, or does it come through reductions in unit costs? And either way, or both, how do we ensure that that full value, or the full value that should, does really get passed back to consumers? And a final ask, which comes from our paper, is that given the apparent confusion about what the real value of demand-side management in the domestic sphere will be, we would suggest that an evaluation framework around it should be developed, sort of along the lines of the evaluation framework for smart grids, which was developed by the Smart Grids Forum, or for the Smart Grids Forum. And we would suggest that something similar was developed around demand-side management, so that we can really see what its kind of value will be. And that's it.